Hey there, Squirrel Army. Today, I'm going to be discussing when it takes time for the penny to drop.
You can join the Squirrel Army by subscribing.
Alright, so we're talking about when it takes time for the penny to drop. And this is, I guess, an old saying, nowadays, I suppose, but it's still a very true kind of idea and kind of statement that basically sometimes it takes a long time for any idea or any thought to kind of really process in people. And I've had this happen to myself as well. So, I'm not just saying this, people need to drop the penny and need to realize all this stuff and blah, blah, blah. No, this has happened to me, and it's taken me a long time to realize, you know what? Actually, this is actually pretty good and whatnot. And sometimes that manifests in singular cards and whatnot. Like, I'm still going to be against certain cards myself, like Temple of the False God and whatnot, and cards like that, because I don't think they're worth it and I don't recommend them to people. But I have seen people play them, now here and there, and, they do work sometimes. Like I say, they're not as net zero cards, so I've gone, well, then perhaps not as bad as what I had thought, perhaps. But again, they're not that good still. They're not consistent, and the value that they do give you sometimes like that isn't really worth the other side of the coin to me, and I wouldn't recommend it for other people. But again, some of these other things are things that I would recommend to people that, perhaps the penny hasn't really dropped on. Like I said before, I found, in the last, I don't know, couple of years that I actually don't mind a little bit of stacks stroke tax style effects. Now, I did say with a sort of caveat there that there can easily be too much, and I don't play things like Drannith Magistrate and things like that, because that just means basically people can't play their commanders and things like that. And, this is a game called Commander, and I want people to play the game of Commander. I don't want people just to be like, cool, we're locked out of playing our commanders until somebody kills this stupid thing. I want people to be able to play the game to an extent. I just don't want people to, run away with the game completely, and for me to be, left there in the dust and being like, oh no, because a lot of the decks that I do play, even though I play sort of aggro decks for the most part, take a long time to really establish kind of what they're doing. So I found that running some amount of stacks and tax sort of cards was very useful. Some of them weren't as useful as others, and I found that one of the ones that I was using for quite a while wasn't really that amazingly good, and that sort of thing, because I was like going, well, instead of just giving my protection on my turn, it's much better for me to give my stuff protection all of the time, like just on my combat or just on my turn. Certainly, there are things to say about, people not being able to cast spells during your turn and things like that, because, again, that can stop counter spells. But for the most, and like some activated abilities, maybe there are a few that I haven't really thought of, but there aren't that many really big activated abilities in the game that, perhaps, if you've got the ability to activate your planeswalkers at instant speed, maybe, then sure, but for the most part, there's not that many activated abilities that are out there, and I don't even think that there's that many ways to activate planeswalkers at flash speed anyway, but still, like, there aren't that many abilities that people like will activate that you really care about on your turn for the most part of artifacts and enchantments. Or even lands or whatever. Like, I'm just going to sacrifice my fetch land to go find a land. That's all I'm doing. and to run those cards that say you can't activate abilities of things that aren't mana abilities effectively doesn't really do a whole lot for the most part. Yes, it can do stuff here and there, but for the most part, it's just like, well, that doesn't really help that much. And it actually also hinders you as well sometimes, those sorts of effects. I know Leonin Arbiter is one card that I've been playing quite a lot, and in my 4-color deck that I have, it's kind of a bad card to play sometimes because that deck is very heavily reliant on getting its colors and fetching to get those colors and that sort of thing. So it's just one of those things that if you play it before you've got all your colors, you kind of screw yourself over because you've got to pay the 2 to tutor for yourself. So it can be very annoying in that regard as well, but still, it's just one of those things sometimes that kind of happens when you're kind of, going through these decks and going, oh, the penny just dropped. This card isn't as good in this deck. It's still really good because I don't want other people to tutor, or I want to limit people tutoring or whatever. So sometimes you've just got to live with the fact that you're taxing yourself or whatever. And that sort of thing. But again, perhaps or you've got to hopefully, mitigate it, kind of before people start really tutoring for their haymakers or their win cons. So you don't want to sort of slow people down from getting their colors or getting their mana and getting established and that sort of thing. You just want people to not be able to get their busted stuff when, the time calls for it. Even like something like Bowl's Citadel, you don't want somebody tutoring for that because that's probably just going to, go silly and things like that, especially if they've got ways to gain life as well and things like that. So, but still, it's one of those things that, like that penny dropped to me to go, you know what, stacks and that aren't too bad as long as you aren't playing too many of them or you're only playing the ones that sort of do smaller, sort of things that don't really require too much fussing around or, whatnot. Again, Thalia, who says your opponent's creatures enter tapped, and I can't remember the enchantment that basically does the same thing. I think it's Blind Obedience. I think there's another one, but I can't remember its name. But anyway, Authority of the Consuls, I just thought of it. But yeah, those sorts of things aren't too bad. But because you can just say, hey, haste creatures, no haste creatures effectively. And that's one of the big things about like that and some of those things. It's like, well, Krenko exists and those sorts of things. There are a lot of decks that have things like Impact Tremors and Perforos and that sort of thing out there still, and that one and whatnot, and those are very good cards as well. So, and all sorts of pingers and things like that. So it doesn't really stop those decks that are, kind of not really doing those sorts of things, but it does slow some of the effects down to an extent, and just gives you that turn to go, okay, now where am I at, kind of thing. And I think that's one of those things that a lot of players, when they're early on in their Magic careers or whatever you want to say, their Magic journey, perhaps, and that's perhaps like the evolution of Commander players as you mature in this game, slowly but surely you suddenly start to realize, oh, this is why this card is played, so much in, these strategies, because, it's actually really good to kind of do this sort of thing because, you're running a really slow deck and you have really two options when you're running a deck that takes a longer time to sort of set up and really do anything of any real note than any of the other decks is. You either have to put your foot on the gas and try to go as fast as possible to get to those late game things, or you have to start going, okay, I'm going to try to slow everyone else down so that I have the chance to actually enact my strategy, enact my game plan, and do whatever it is that I'm doing. There's lots of cards that are out there that I think people go, and there's certainly sometimes when suddenly a new commander or a new card or a new combo or whatever else it is sort of gets printed, suddenly people go, oh crap, this card is really good in this circumstance. When they introduced treasures, Viridian Revel suddenly became really good, and Titania's Song suddenly became really good because suddenly, like you could shut off the treasure production and that sort of thing of these decks, and slow them down significantly. And Collector Roof, and whatever. What's the I can't remember the white enchantment, Stony Silence. There we go. That kind of do that same sort of thing. It doesn't sound nice to a degree to shut down all the artifacts, or whatever, but you're just trying to sort of slow people down. And if they're playing Rakdos or Dimir or something, perhaps they're in a lot of trouble because they don't really have a lot of removal in those colors for enchantments. Perhaps if you're playing the Collector Oof, they do, but still, like again, like if you're playing the enchantment versions of some of these things, it can be a little bit like, well, they just don't have much removal for that, or if they have removal at all for this. So it's probably going to stick there, and they're probably not going to be able to do anything about it. So it's just one of those things that now the game for them is, close to being over in a sense, but that's where you kind of don't want it. You want everyone to have a chance, but you don't want somebody to be out and out, like out of the game permanently. So again, it's tough to kind of play some of these things because you don't want to just be like, okay, this player doesn't get to play the game. You don't want to be playing cards that just shut people out. But sometimes you kind of have to, like, or at least you have to slow them down to the point of going, well, you're shut out for, whatever number of turns until you either decide to tutor for the card to destroy this thing, or you just naturally draw it. And if that's a one-of in your deck, then, good luck or whatever. But still, it's just one of those things that, especially when you have somebody who is playing a perhaps more powerful deck than the rest of the table, it sometimes is one of those things that these stacks effects, when you play them, often don't really affect some of the players that are playing just fair generic decks out of the box. So you're going, well, these are actually kind of bad in this circumstances. But when somebody is playing a deck that's a lot more powerful, suddenly it starts scaling them back to being on par with the rest of the people that are kind of playing. So it can help even the playing field among the players and the decks, so that, again, those players that are a bit newer to the format can get their chance at, showing off what their deck can do, and not just being like, cool, well, this guy basically won, on whatever, an early turn before we could really get established, which is kind of feels bad, but again, that's where, you do have to have those conversations and whatnot before the game sometimes. But again, some people will misrepresent their decks and things like that, either intentionally or unintentionally, or perhaps not even, think to ask, oh yeah, what level are you all playing at or whatever. That happens a lot too sometimes. But if you're ever playing people that you haven't played with before, I would often just say, again, you need to ask, where are we all at, kind of thing. But yeah, again, like, it's one of those things that if people go, well, I don't see why this card is played or why this card is good, like, it's the same for me when I look at Cultivating Kadama's Reach and things like that. I don't get kind of why they're so heavily played. I don't think they're that amazing, but I think the idea is that you've got 2 lands out of your deck for 3 mana, and that's a pretty decent rate. Yeah, sure, only one of them goes to the field and the other one goes to your hand. And the idea there is, if you have missed your land drop, that you've got your land drop, so kind of both of them, you can at least perhaps even play another land, that land that you just shooted for, if you haven't already played a land. And perhaps even so, again, it's the idea that, well, even if I can't play that land, that, at least next turn I'm guaranteed to have a land, and I have sort of cut another land that's in my deck out of my deck. So again, I'm kind of less likely to draw land, so I'll more likely draw gas. So that could be another reason for it. And another reason why I kind of get it, but I kind of don't get why Sol Ring and I get why Sol Ring, but why people play like Mana Rocks in green. There are very few commanders that actually care about Mana Rocks in green, but I see so many people play Mana Rocks in green, and I guess they're living the dream of going, I can turn one Sol Ring, then again play a Mana Rock and go from there. Turn one my Mana Rock, my turn two Mana Rock and Sol Ring into a Mana Rock. So they're kind of trying to live that dream of going, on turn one having 4 mana or 5 mana effectively. So that's why I think some people do it. Also, I think that some people's perspective is, well, a Mana Rock has haste for the most part, except for like all the signets, which don't, because you've got to have another mana to tap them. So there is that. But again, there's this idea that, it doesn't, like, no creatures have haste, so why would I use them on that turn? So there's no real point in playing them, and whatnot and that sort of thing. Again, it depends what deck you're doing, but even so, when you've got a deck that revolves around spells like a Temur deck or whatever else it is, then I get like running certain spells. It does depend what you're doing. Like Calamax, you want to be running instants in that deck. So again, that's a bit of a different call to say, well, what instant speed ramp do I kind of have that is on spells? That's a bit different than saying, well, what sorcery speed ramp do I have that's in these colors? Because then you go, well, I've got Nature's Law and I've got this, I've got 3 visits. So, or I've got, again, I've got some of the instant speed ones or whatever. Or if I've got something that says I can play spells at instant speed, now those spells are much better. The sorceries that I have are much better because, again, now I don't have to wait or just do something on my turn. I can sort of read the room and read the board. That's why, like, Vedalken Ori, it is a good card, but it's sort of a good stuff card. No deck wouldn't be somewhat, to a degree, almost better off having it because, again, the flexibility is there. But then again, is the investment kind of worth it? So I'm going to take that turn off to have better turns later. And it does depend, again, what you're doing. I have a Simic deck that wants to play, on everyone's turns. So it's one of those things that sort of thing finds its way into the deck because the deck wants to cast as many things at as many opportunities as what it can and that sort of thing. So it's very, very important to have that flash speed be available to that deck. It's not really as important for other decks that I have. So again, knowing what decks I really need to put it in and knowing, the coin going through the system and finally dropping, going, this is a good card, but it doesn't really work for anything I'm really doing. Like, again, having that moment of clarity going, yes, Crater Hoof is a very powerful card. And I'm never going to say that card is bad, but, knowing that it's hit and miss. Because if you say, well, I could have a board full of stuff, but I could also have a board full of nothing. And there are a few cards that people kind of poo-poo as being cards that are too dependent on the board. And certainly I have gone through a lot of my decks to go get rid of some of those cards because, again, you don't want cards that are too dependent on the board state. But if you say, oh, just replace it with Craterhoof, well, that's a card that's literally, again, reliant on you having a board state for it to really do a whole lot of anything. So you're saying for me to replace a card that's reliant on the board state because it's too reliant on the board state with a card that's reliant on the board state. So having that moment of going, wait, this person's giving me advice that is roundabout advice that basically, doesn't make any sense. And again, if I'm playing a deck, I don't want to just play any card. I want to play cards that work with the synergies that what I'm trying to do. And I don't just want a one-off effect for the most part because, board wipes come into this and removal comes into this. But for the most part, you want, things that will continue to give you things throughout the entire game, even if they get removed. Well, they gave me 3 or 4 turns or whatever it was of doing something, of giving me some kind of, advantage. And, I really utilized that well to get ahead or to get to the next step. Sometimes you don't get that because, you're just unlucky or just the cards didn't line up in the right way or somebody board wiped at the wrong time because you didn't have haste or because, you couldn't really do anything or whatnot, that sort of thing in response. You couldn't really protect yourself. You couldn't really gain back that, that position. So it's one of those things about knowing kind of the application, and you can't always do that, especially when you're a newer player, for some of these things. And it does take time sometimes, as to sort of say, and that's why I think some people, again, you need to listen to advice, but you need to take it with a grain of salt. But you also need to be able to be allowed that time to process what kind of somebody has said and not just sometimes jump to the conclusion of, I don't know whether they know what they're talking about. They've obviously formed, you have to put this in front of yourself to say, they've obviously formed this opinion for some reason. So how come they've formed this opinion? Why are they putting this opinion out there to say, hey, this is a card that you should run, or this isn't a card you should run, or whatever? You should be analyzing that for yourself. Why does this person say this? Going, well, how do I interpret that for myself? How do I make myself understand why they've kind of gone this way and done this route and whatever else? So beginning to develop yourself and go, well, why are people doing this? Why are people not doing that? Why are, decks looking more and more like they're 1 and 2 drops or whatever, 3 and 4 drops than 5 and 6 drops, especially the ones that don't really have a big impact? It's because, again, those cards, are a big impact card usually when they're at 6 and 7. When you're playing a haymaker card, of course it's going to either warp the game or win you the game, in a sense, because, or for the most part at least, because, again, why would you spend, so much more mana than what you would normally be paying for any other card unless it's going to literally, nearly win you the game or win you the game? You wouldn't invest all that mana, you wouldn't invest all that time. And again, there's counter spells, there's removal, there's this, there's that, there's all these things that exist in the game to say, well, that card doesn't always do the thing that it will do, but when it does the thing that it will do, oh boy, is it worth the mana? Oh yeah, that's why I say Craterhoof isn't a bad card. I wouldn't play it personally myself, but it's just one of those cards. Again, I don't recommend either because it's just one of those things. It is a very hit and miss card, and it doesn't really have synergy with anything for the most part. I prefer things like Blossoming Bogbeast because that's a really, pretty good card. Gains you 2 life, which is pretty nice. Helps you stay in the game for longer. Buffs up your creatures. And, that's every single turn that it's out on the field. It's not as big or as impactful as Crater Hoof, but again, it does a, sort of similar effect, and it's persistent. So and again, getting that life every single turn is definitely very good as well, because again, is just one of those things. Like, it doesn't fix Voltron damage, but it fixes a lot of little things. And yes, it's only 2, but again, just that little bit extra life gain sometimes is what you kind of need just to kind of stabilize. And yes, you have to attack with the thing, but again, it buffs everything up, including itself, and gives it trample and all that sort of stuff. But still, those sorts of effects, again, are the sorts of effects that, the penny kind of almost drops right away, because you can see the applications right there. It's a card that does a similar thing to Crater Hoof. It does it consistently, and, throughout the rest of the game for as long as it's on the field. It's not as big of a threat as Crater Hoof, though people should treat it as a sort of level of, perhaps not Crater Hoof, but something that they need to remove effectively in the next few turns, because again, you getting that repeated value out of it is going to win you those games. And just having those cards where you have to think through them is a bit more. You have to be able to, understand your synergy or understand kind of what you're doing. I had built a Rakdos deck recently, and in that deck, I put all of the, Zulaport Cutthroat style of effects to drain people's lives, because it was a sacrifice aristocrat style deck. But then I went and had the coin drop, because I was like, wow, my commander actually does a lot of the pinging anyway. So instead of having all of these things that are also pingers that are in my deck, I can save space in my deck for other things, and I can equip my commander with things that equipment that effectively give it lifelink, and then I'll gain even more life from my commander because it deals damage to my opponents. So that's really, really useful, and a really, really good way of, I didn't realize it until I played it and went, you know what, my commander actually does this effect pretty well for me, so I really don't need that effect very much in my deck. I actually just need more ways to increase that damage, or increase my life gain from that damage, or get some other benefits that will help me stay in the game, or stay ahead of my opponents, or stay out of range of my opponents for long enough to keep that engine going and for me to actually win that game. Yes, those other life draining effects would do a similar job in a sense, but they don't really help me for the most part, because they're just another, in effect, liability in a way, because again, they're not really helping what the commander's already doing pretty well. The commander just needs to be able to give me more throughout its own effects and its own synergies, rather than me trying to go, well, I'll just run more of these other things. Yes, you can run maybe a couple of other ones or whatever, because you want some level of redundancy or whatever, but also I've started putting Dictate of Erebos and Grave Pact in that deck, because I realized that one of the bigger things about that deck was needing to have asymmetrical sort of effects, and being able to slow other people down, again, by making them have to sacrifice some of their creatures, was really well worth the time, because otherwise you kind of just get run over. You're doing all these sacrificing things, and there's not many. I don't even think there's any ghostly prison. Actually, I think there's one that stops green creatures from attacking you. I mean, there is the land that does it, but again, whatever. Still, it's one of those things that you don't have very many ways to really protect yourself from getting attacked in that sort of deck. So it's just one of those things where you need to, at the end of the day, you know, get a lot of that life gain going, and again, be able to protect yourself. And just having the command being able to gain you effectively 3 life for every creature you sacrifice is pretty darn decent, especially when you're effectively, again, doing 3 damage or 1 damage divided amongst each of your opponents. That's pretty good for each creature. So again, there are some things that you could say this could be good or whatever, but having those asymmetrical effects just to slow those creatures down on the field, Butcher of Malakir, etc., again, really helped that deck feel a lot better. Yes, again, perhaps those are things that my opponents will not absolutely love, but at least they get the choice of what they sacrifice. For the most part, I still will use a bunch of removal in that deck to remove certain things as well, but just having those opponents have to make those choices is one of those things. But I don't want it just to be on, I don't know, at the beginning of their upkeep they have to sacrifice a creature or whatever, because that doesn't really do what I want. Because I'm already sacrificing creatures, I might as well make my opponents have to sacrifice a creature for each creature I sacrifice. So something like Braids does that pretty well. Even if they don't do that, you get other benefits out of it. And if they do it, you get even more benefits, because again, you're sacrificing your creature, and when you have Grave Pact or these other effects, they're all compounding on each other, snowballing and synergizing together and crushing your opponents. So that's the kind of idea that you want. You want those moments of going, after so, and again, sometimes it takes playing cards or experiencing things for yourself to go, these cards that I thought would be good or whatever don't actually kind of work. They do something, but realistically, I have that effect in my command zone, so I don't really need it elsewhere for the most part. I've already got that effect going on. So, I don't really need to think about that. So, I have my +1/+1 counters deck. I've talked about it a bit here and there. But that deck is helmed by a commander that is effectively a mana dork and also turns all of my humans into mana dorks. So while there's not very many other ramping effects more, in general in that deck, there are maybe a few in that deck, not none, but it is somewhat reliant on the commander, but the commander is only 2 mana, so it's not that big of an investment, and usually you only need your commander out for a few turns anyway before it's really generated enough value off of making mana by itself or by making all of your creatures into mana dogs, so that again you can start that whole idea going. And that's why, again, that deck became much more focused on human tribal, because again, it was that, wow, I really want humans in this deck, and I really want humans, especially if they have activated abilities like Dustwatch Recruiter and things like that. I can't remember what the white one's called, but yeah, those sorts of effects were really good in that deck, because it's well, if I have a whole bunch of mana, I can just, dump all that mana into their activated abilities to get more card advantage. And they provide mana because they're humans, so that works really well with the commander. Plus, again, the commander will buff them up, and eventually, at least they're defensive. If nothing else, if you've got one of your, enablers to give them flying or whatever, trample or whatever, then they're really good because suddenly you've got these, or death touch. Now suddenly you've got these really big things or evasive things that, will punch for a bit of damage. And especially when you've got something to untap those creatures, it becomes really quite gross, because then you can just go past the turn, go to an opponent's turn, and still have your mana to cast, other things and that sort of thing. So you don't really have to worry when you've got that kind of effect going on, because again, that, hey, I've got Seaborn Muse, so hey, here we go, boys. Seaborn Muse is going to, help us out to get to the next point of, even though Seaborn isn't actually in that deck, I don't think, but still that idea of, this is what we're going to do. We're going to untap our stuff and we're going to have access to all our mana next turn anyway. So there's no real huge worry about tapping out, or having vigilance, same sort of thing. In my Simic deck, that's why that deck works really well, is because the commander not only turns things into mana dorks, but it gives them vigilance. So when you attack, you don't have to tap, so that on your second main phase, then you can just tap all your creatures for mana and cast something big after you've sort of drawn cards or whatever else and things like that. So yeah, it sometimes takes that going, okay, what does that want to do? I want to untap things and draw cards either from tapping things or untapping things or casting things, and I want things that are evasive in combat or whatever, and big and powerful enough to get through those combats to really, advance that game plan. So again, internalizing it into what you're doing and going through the processes of getting that coin to drop for yourself is very important. But I think I've lingered on enough and made my point pretty well. For those people who have made it this far, I know it's a very slim number of people, but thank you so much for listening. And you can always let me know what you guys think, writing your thoughts down there in the comments below. And hope you will join me again in another one.